just made them in the right order, but I didn't. So anyway, it is 3.3. There's an after-school environmental film tonight that plays again tomorrow. It's about 1 hour-ish. It's an episode of Oregon Public Broadcasting. They had a special called Silent Invasion about invasive species. Same movie tonight or tomorrow. You can see it one of those 2 nights. I wanted everyone here to know that my Green Club students, who were A students last year, have decided to offer free tutoring. Thursdays at lunch in my room. If I'm not mistaken, they're going to ask you to bring them lunch. So it's free. But, you may want to bro down and be like, yo, you want half my burrito or something, so that they are motivated to keep offering you the free tutoring. Just saying. Thursdays at lunch in this room. In other words, starting tomorrow. And today I want to talk about assignment 3.1 with niches and specialists and generalists. But in order to do that, we got to agree on what evolution is. And in order to do that, I want to talk a little bit about history. And I thought a good way to get you curious about that history would be to show you those neat pictures by that funny-looking dude. Did anybody get a picture of the actual man, by the way?
Yeah, we did. How funny looking was he?
He was a hair-farming 1650s sort of guy. Like fancy silks and ruffled collars and
pointing at his show.
Beautiful curly hair.
Oh, wow.
You got a picture of Placebo right there?
Yeah, it's called.
Yeah, that's the man right there. Yep. Beauteous. Will you please send that picture to Sam Ruggieri? Sam Ruggieri, is it S?
RUGGIERI 1, 2, 3, 4.
Yahoo?
Yeah.
AKA the playa address.
Yep.
Playa's gotta play. Don't hate.
Are you making a taco out of your burrito?
Am I what now? No, I'm just keeping it warm. Okay. Anybody else find a good picture of the dude? Because that picture, actually, I kind of love it. It shows him standing in front of this giant collection of jars. Do you see that in the background of that picture? There's shelves and shelves of glass jars.
Is he playing?
And he's holding a preserved specimen of something. There was a funny time in the history of science that I love this story. I just think it's super neat. Sam, there's one that someone just emailed you of the dude. Those are you're getting social pictures. Yeah. So, period. Those are period images. So, back in the mid 1600s, I think everybody knows that there was this wave of global exploration and colonization. You've heard this, right? The European superpowers were basically owning the rest of the planet through force and sometimes fairly atrocious villainy and sometimes through perhaps gentler means. Europe was trying to take over the world. Africa, Asia, the Americas. The Europeans were going hog wild. And people go to Madagascar, come back, and it's hey dude, tell me about your trip. And the dude's I saw these crazy monkeys that would like jump through the trees, and they had these like long tails with like, wow, that's pretty neat. And somebody's like, I went to this place at the southern end of Africa, and there were these giant animals with big teeth. And these really tall ones with spots and crazy long necks. Nowadays, you've been raised, when you were a little tiny baby, people were showing you all of these imagery and iconic, memorable things about the world's biodiversity. But you know, in the 1600s, when little babies were growing up, all that they knew was the stuff around them. And you may be surprised to know that Europe is actually not very biodiverse. Somebody your age growing up in England would have seen, you know, a few dozen different bird and animal species, and that's about it. A few dozen. Your pajamas had prints when you were a little child of exotic fish and exotic mammals and birds and whatnot. But in the early 1600s, nobody knew about that stuff. And as these empires were spreading across the globe, people brought back stories of really neat animals and neat plants and neat fish and neat birds. And the thing that I find so interesting is that wealthy people collected them. The way that wealthy people today collect cars or sports memorabilia or exotic guns or whatever, watches. Wealthy people today are really into collecting watches. Women with shoes sometimes. Dude with shoes sometimes. My homie Tim has like 200 pairs of shoes. In the 1600s, there was this trend of collecting biodiversity. People kept them in these things called cabinets of natural curiosities. And when international voyages would leave their port, it would be very expensive to buy all that food and buy all that ammunition. And you only need so many crew to sail the ship. But you've got to find some way to buy all the supplies needed for the journey. So a lot of these boats would sell a seat to a sponsored naturalist who was employed by a wealthy person in Europe. So Lord Ruggieri is curious to know about the birds of Africa, and he pays Jose Caballero, some college dropout with a gun. He goes, hey, how much does it cost to put Jose on your boat? And the captain says, all right, we'll feed him, we'll give him a bunk, we'll make sure that he has some storage space, he'll have, alcohol and room and board and ammunition for $1,000. And Lord Ruggieri says, okay, I will sponsor a seat for Jose Caballero, my hired naturalist. And the boat leaves Europe and goes out to Africa and trades ivory for beads or whatever. And while Jose is on the trip, my job is to shoot stuff, taxidermy it or preserve it somehow, and bring it back to my boss. And check out what Sam Ruggieri does. With his collection, he just paid someone to bring him diversity of another nation. He has a team of taxidermists, preservationists. And he puts these things in this giant collection. And they were called, as a social trend at the time, cabinets of natural curiosities. And then he has dinner parties for all of his wealthy friends. And they all get all powdered up and put on their best wigs and their really nice silk ruffled shirts and their 13,000 layer suits. And they all show up at the Ruggieri Palace, and Ruggieri goes, welcome everybody, we have a giant feast, please eat quickly. The festivities begin at 5. And everybody walks into the great hall of the Ruggieri mansion. And he goes, "Welcome everyone! Today I'd like to show you my collection of exotic birds of Africa." And he goes, "Ta-da!" And he like opens up his cabinets of curiosities. And he's got like 400 species of birds that are all stuff. Women wore them as hats, by the way. This is a good thing to include in the slideshow, homie. The birds of paradise of New Zealand were driven to extinction by their explosive hat commodity value. Women would stuff them and wear them as hats with like huge feathers. Women would walk down the street wearing like a 6-foot bird on their head. No joke. I find this interesting for a lot of ways. One thing, you all know I was born in South America, and colonial issues are really important to a lot of us immigrants because we come from colonial countries. The United States, I think you know, was a colonial nation before it reached independence kind of early on. And colonial politics are interesting, and I am, just on a separate note, I'm fascinated by colonial history. Separate from this, I'm a scientist, and I'm very interested about how the public interacts with science. And this period of natural curiosities, I find this to be like a really neat time. I mean, imagine, rich people would show their wealth by showing off jars of fish that nobody else had seen before. Fish from all over the world. Look at all of my fishes of Lake Malawi. And people would go, "Oh, they're so colorful." And you'd have like thousands of jars of fish from Lake Malawi. Or you would say, "Everybody check it out, the butterflies of New Guinea." And I just find that to be like so intriguing. You know, today the wealthy are not that big on showing off nature. It's not something that we really celebrate. Imagine, instead of taking your kids to the zoo, the wealthiest people would pay others to hunt a zoo and bring it to their house. This is a different way to think about the world, I think. And I find this personally very interesting. There were artists who kind of made their living. Like Alberto Siba with all of his neat art. By the way, they got stuff wrong sometimes, and so who had the octopus one? Yeah? You have it on?
Yeah.
There's a really famous painting that I think was made by Alberto Siba of an octopus that had the wrong type of eyeballs, because you know eyeballs don't preserve very well. When you take an octopus out of the ocean, they're all like squishy and weird. And so, is your thing locked? Your perspective locked?
Oh, yeah, here.
Yeah, it's too much trouble. Look, if you all can see this, I can't even enlarge this.
Here.
Make it bigger. I just want to show the eye. Just make it, I want to see a big picture of the eye. When they drew the eyeball, they gave the octopus the wrong shaped eyeball. So if you all can see that, the octopus has like a human-like eyeball. It's like a big white disc with a black dot in it. Did everybody see that? Can you see that in the back? Sorry. Soon I'll have a slideshow for this. That's what San Ruggieri's working on. But they got the facts wrong sometimes, like this octopus with mammal-like eyeballs. Because, you know, the eyeballs wouldn't preserve. This was some of the first efforts by scientists of Europe to try to understand life. And people started to notice these interesting patterns. The life on each of these separate areas is distinct. This became known as biogeography. That's one of your vocab terms today. People would notice these patterns like, hey look, all of my lizards from the Americas are kind of skinny and have long tails and like high foreheads, but all of my lizards from Africa have kind of like flat bodies and shorter legs, and they're kind of broader with shorter tails. And we now know, because of evolution and Charlie Darwin and so on, that the Americas have iguanids because those evolved separate from Africa's agamid lizards, which evolved on a separate continent at a separate time. But when people were looking at their cabinets of curiosities, they were like, wow, what a weird pattern. When classifying these different things, we came up with a new science. It's another one of your vocab terms called taxonomy, which means to organize things into taxa. That's actually the vocab word. Which are like categories that identify living organisms. There was these two separate patterns that people noticed. The biogeographic realms, which I think were, this was animal, I believe, right? The realms was animals?
Yeah.
And separately, people who looked at preserved plants noticed these patterns of vegetation, where like all the flower types are over here, like all the orchids live in this area, and all of the eucalyptus live over here, and all of the oak trees live over here, all the pine trees live in this chunk. And this is the period where Charles Darwin made a big difference. Does everybody here know that I'm primarily an evolutionary biologist? Did I tell you about that? So I had a triple major: zoology, ecology, evolution with an emphasis on evolution, and physical anthropology. And the thing that weaves those majors together, my primary topic, is how behaviors have evolved. The evolution of behaviors, especially reproductive behaviors, especially in humans. I'm obsessed with Charles Darwin. And I'll tell you a quick little story about Charles Darwin. Does everybody here know that he was kind of a loser who was raised by a really powerful family? Have you guys heard this story? So his mommy and daddy were very powerful, and his financial future looked really secure when he was young. So he was like, Mom, Dad, I don't want to go to school. I just want to sit around and like drink beer, party. And his mom and dad were like, no, son, you've got to make something of yourself. And he's like, why, Mom? We already have all the money I'm ever going to need. And they're like, no. You're going to have to distinguish yourself. And he's like, okay, fine. And so he signed up for medical school, and he had to drop out in the first couple months because he was like, because he was sort of like a wimp about surgery and stuff. You guys haven't heard this story? So he went to like his first lecture where they like cut open a cadaver, and he passed out. They were like, Charlie's a wimp. He's like, no, I can do this. And so he made himself stay up for the next one, and he threw up. And so he goes home, and he's like, Mom, Dad, I'm not cut out to be a doctor. I'm like, okay, fine. Go do something else. He's like, I'll become a priest. Yeah, I could do that, priest. And so he went into the seminary. Is that what it's called? For seminary for nuns or for priests? I always get this wrong. Whatever, I'm just going to go with it. What?
Monks?
Yeah, to be a monk. What is it? Seminary? Monastery? Monastery. So he went to go become a monk. I don't know. And apparently he thought that was too boring, and like he's like, whoa, celibacy, I never signed up for this. And like he got out of that, and he was like sitting around like, I can't figure out what I want to do when I grow up. And his parents were like, you're a grown-up, get a life, you loser. And he's like, I don't know, I just don't want to do anything. I just want to sit around and like drink beer and party. And they're like, no, you got to do something. And so his father bought him a seat on this expedition on this little boat you may have heard of called the Beagle. That's right, the Voyage of the Beagle. Super famous story. This was a boat that was going to go like map the coast of the Americas and set up trade relationships for the Spanish government, the English government, French government. It was like a government expedition to go build trade relationships, find people that are willing to trade with the nation. His dad buys him a seat on the thing, and his job, Charles Darwin, was to be one of these naturalists that collected stuff. How many of you have heard that after the voyage of the Beagle, Charles Darwin came home and eventually wrote this book called On the Origin of Species that proposed the method of natural selection? You've heard this? So the story is kind of confusing because he got famous, for his theory. That was kind of a byproduct. First of all, he went out there to shoot and kill stuff. Lost in the details of this story is that he was very good at that. And so on his journey, I forget the exact number now. You can look this up somewhere on the interweb. But he shot something like 500,000 birds and animals. Apparently he loved eating exotic birds.
How did he get enough ammunition to shoot all those?
Dude, the legend has it he went through like 2 barrels of pellet. His diary is mostly stuff that he killed and stuff that he ate. He's like, oh, that one sea turtle, not so good. That one giant parrot, that was really tasty. He was like a younger dude, like 20s somewhere, and like he was just kind of growing into his manliness, and like the guns sort of gave him something to do, and he was good at it, so he had kids that would help him and go collect stuff. So he would walk out with all these cages and buckets and boxes and plant presses and be like, you, go cut up that plant and squeeze the leaves, and you, go get that bird, and then they would shoot stuff, and they would put it all in jars, and they would taxidermy on the boat, and they would skin stuff and preserve all the furs. On this trip, though, he started to notice some patterns, and this is the part that we now segue. Charles Darwin helped us understand. Later, by the way, he didn't publish that book for many years. When he got home, he wrote it, he kept it on the shelf. Does anybody know why he actually wrote that book, why he published it?
Someone else, I don't remember his name, but they said they sent him a letter saying, hey, this is my theory, and it kind of corresponded with his. So they both published their separate things, but they worked together.
That's actually very close, although if you look at their letter, their correspondence, it wasn't quite that friendly.
Oh, yeah, no, they didn't like each other.
Charles Darwin gets back from his trip. He gives his employer all of their natural curiosities. He goes on the circuit, like telling stories, for people would pay him to come tell stories about what he saw in the wild. And because he was a very well-known man from a powerful family and stuff, another scientist in a separate country sent him a manuscript that was like, hey, could you look this over for me? I had this idea about how species change over time. And Charles Darwin sees Wallace's manuscript and goes, oh, this guy's going to get the scoop. So they didn't work together. Darwin sabotaged him. Darwin said, this is a total mess. Rewrite chapters 1 through 11. Check your data on chapter 6. And you probably want to throw out this whole thing. Good luck. Send me the next version in about 6 months. And in the meantime, he literally sent that out to the mail in the same day. He walked over to the presses and went, hey, could you guys write my book really quick? I need this to be out right away. Like tomorrow. Because he knew that the other guy was going to get the jump on him. George Wallace looked at his letters and was like, bro. So his response was, I'm actually pretty confident. Thanks for your oversight. I'm going to go ahead and publish anyway. And Darwin was like, oh my God. And, I had some very interesting thoughts, and I've also written a book that's already in print about similar ideas.
And so Charles Darwin kind of weaseled his way competitively into fame. But George Wallace could have done the book anyway. Now Charles Darwin.
The theory, yeah.
How did George Wallace figure out?
By the way, I'm not sure it's George Wallace. Anybody want to correct me on that?
How did the other dude figure out the ideas of
Independently, and I don't really have his story. I want to make sure that we all understand how evolution works. Anybody have a good way to describe natural selection for me? Yeah?
Trial and error. A species will generally have many different things that it does. Like it's just a flower can use pollination to spread its genetics to other flowers, and that's really how to describe it.
This is getting too long. Anybody else? How's evolution work by natural selection?
Survival of the fittest.
Fine phrase. How else does evolution work?
the traits that get passed on that are better.
Now we're getting there. What else?
The way it goes best adapted to its environment, make it adapt to environment.
Over time.
Yeah. With specific changes.
Specific changes. Its niche.
Yeah.
Yes?
It's kind of like traits that allow for the organism to reproduce better or more successfully.
And where do these traits come from? Like how?
Mutations.
Okay. So we got to get a couple of our facts straight, but you're starting to put together the right thing, and there's a few words that I want you to write down to make sure we're all on the same page. First of all, evolution can only act on existing variation, and that's a key issue, existing variation. Evolution doesn't make anything. Evolution selects things. Evolution doesn't make you taller. Evolution benefits the tallest. Evolution selects the tallest to have babies. That's what's being selected. In natural selection, here it comes. Nature selects the most successful traits from existing variation. Thus, the more successful traits become more common over time, because they're the ones that have more babies. So over time, species change to better suit their environment. What I want you to notice is that's circumstantial. That's not on purpose. There's nobody in charge. Nobody's at the wheel. You don't design perfection. There's no end point. Natural selection is just whoever's better has more babies. That's the survival of the fittest part. Whoever's better has more babies. And you know, Homeboy saw this on his trip. When Charles Darwin was out there, he was like, on this island that has a bunch of cactus, the finches have a beak that lets them eat the fruit of the cactus. But on this island that has a bunch of grasses that make seeds, the birds have a beak that's really good at eating seeds. And on this island that has big old trees with lots of big juicy fruit, the birds have bigger beaks that are really good for eating the fruit. Otherwise, the birds look very similar. Next vocab term, adaptive radiation. As a species spreads into new environments, that's the radiation, it will adapt as it goes. That's the natural selection. So when that bird drops into a new setting, it will adapt to better match that setting. Then when that bird goes to a new island, it will adapt to better match that setting. And then it goes to a new place. It will adapt over time. And now, finally, we get to talk about the rest of this chapter. When Charles Darwin proposed natural selection, everything kind of came together. People looked at these patterns and they said, oh, wait a minute. Maybe that's why all of these birds are the same on this landmass and separate from the other. For example, here's an interesting pattern. Australia has a whole set of mammals that are placental, meaning they are marsupial, excuse me. Australia has marsupial mammals, so they don't keep their babies to develop inside the mama. That little embryo falls out of the mama when it's really tiny, and then it crawls up her gut and lives inside this big old pouch. Does anybody know the only marsupial that lives outside of Australia? Very good, the opossum, right. Coincidentally, the only animal that can be spelled two different ways, possum and opossum.
That's the only marsupial that lives outside.
That I know of, correct me if I'm wrong.
I was like...
I believe that's the only marsupial mammal that lives outside of Australia, yeah.
What's the reason for that? How did it get outside of Australia?
Probably they're just pretty tough, and so they must have survived some sort of like storm event that like carried them on a piece of riffraff across the oceans. Anyway, the rest of the world has different diversity. Can anybody explain to me why marsupials only live in Australia? Yeah?
Because when like everything was one continent, and most of the marsupials were kind of in like the Australia area, and when everything split up, most of the marsupials stayed in Australia because they couldn't get to other places, while placental mammals like survived in the other parts.
Yeah, that's pretty much right. If you all look at what used to be called Pangea, this is a crappy drawing. Australia was made of this chunk of Pangea, one of the first pieces to break off. All the mammals used to be marsupial mammals. Because that was the first, that was like mammal 1.0.
What specifically makes it a marsupial?
That the baby doesn't develop inside the mama.
Pouch, kind of.
The pouch. So, mammal 1.0 was marsupials. Australia splits off so that all the land masses, the rest of Pangea and Australia, only had marsupials on them. When the placental mammals take over, they outcompeted the marsupials. Apparently, placental was better. So mammal 2.0 wiped out all the other mammals on the main landmass, but Australia was separate. And now you see this blending of geologic history, tectonics, and natural selection. This is the modern study of the history of biogeography. Just so you know, this is like the type of science that I am pretty psyched about. I did a lot of stuff in macroevolution. I find this really interesting, but I tend to ramble a little bit because I can't figure out how to introduce it right. I see that everybody's a little bit kind of bored, and so I want to move on, but we're going to come back to these topics. In the rest of the vocab in assignment 3.1, anybody have any questions? We've done biogeography, taxa, adaptive radiation. We're going to do the soil terms later when we get to that biome. And we'll do the reading packet vocab later.
Generalist and specialist.
Perfect. I want to discuss generalist and specialist when we do study goal number 1. Anybody else? Yeah? We're going to do this when we get to that biome. Yeah?
Is it supposed to be inertia?
Inertia. And that's in the reading packet.
Yeah.
So we'll get to the reading. Yeah.
Inertia.
Um,
I couldn't find inertia. And I Googled inertia.
Okay.
Yes.
Is ecotone in the next assignment?
It's in this one.
It's in the reading.
It's in the reading. So I want to do the reading vocab when we talk about the reading study goals. That's assignment 3.0.
Okay, we went to.
That's in assignment 3.2. Okay. So students, study goal number 1, critical issue. What is a niche? A lot of you got the wrong thing out of the book, so I really want to discuss this. I don't like the book's definition. What is a niche?
Kind of like an organism's job in their environment, like the role they play.
That's actually the definition I do like, yes. But a lot of you might have the other one about the environmental conditions where an organism can survive.
Yeah.
I don't like that one.
If you combine like the package definition and the first definition, could you say that it's like what she just said, but then also like maintaining like factors like conditions? Is that
Sure, that works for me, yeah. The part that I find most useful is what Cedar said. The book's not wrong, it's just that's not the whole picture.
Cedar, can you repeat yours?
Yeah, so it's pretty much just like the role or job an organism plays in their environment.
The way I like to say it is how a species makes a living. So like when you describe a species' way to survive, that's its niche. Lives in the desert, hides during the day, comes out at night, eats seeds from grasses. That's the kangaroo rat. That's its niche. Nocturnal, desert, seed-eating, small mammal. Some species are really picky. They're highly specialized. In other words, they have a very narrow niche. This is that vocab that someone was asking me about, and this is a key issue. I gotta warn you, this is 3 stars. A generalist has a really broad niche. They can live in a bunch of different environments. They can eat a bunch of different stuff. They're kind of what you'd call flexible. This is Jose. Okay, Erlach?
So would omnivores be more?
What?
Would omnivores be more generalist because they can eat?
Omnivores are more generalist because they're not that picky about what they eat. Specialists are really picky. They've got a really narrow niche, a small niche. And I want to discuss how these different things evolve. Let's see here. What's the right way to do this? Okay, I've got an idea. Look, this is all one species of finches. They're little birds, okay? A couple of these, they only eat on the ground. They just eat on the ground. A couple of them, they only eat in the trees. And a couple of them eat all over the place. Okay? We're gonna come back to this. I want to make sure everybody's on the same page. Only eat on the ground, eat everywhere, only eat in trees. Let's imagine that their environment stays relatively consistent over a very long time. Which of these 3 groups, this one, or this one, which of these 3 groups will face the most competition? Is always going to be competing with someone.
The ground one?
Only eat on the ground, only eat in the trees, eat all over the place. These ones will always be competing with somebody, right? They're either competing with the tree ones, they're competing with the ground, they're competing with each other, they're always competing. Does that make sense? So if the environment stays consistent, does everybody see that because they're always competing, they will over time disappear? They're going to have too much competition, not get enough food, not make enough babies. These two will survive. Does that make sense? This is a really critical term. Here it comes. You might want to write this down. Natural selection splits niches into specialized niches. Into specialized smaller niches. Yeah.
Why wouldn't it be like if they could eat from either one, they could survive so easily?
I want to answer this question. I want everybody to notice I said something before I gave you that setup. I said in an environment which is very consistent, these generalists will lose out to the two specialized versions. That makes sense to everybody? Because you can always eat on the ground, and you can always eat in the trees. Having both of those doesn't help, because that's just too much competition. Right? Now comes a different thing. Watch me. What if this food supply or that food supply wasn't very reliable? It was kind of hit or miss. Now who would win over time?
Generalists? They can eat both things. One's not reliable and the other one is, and they can eat that one.
If this one's not reliable or that one's not reliable, the generalist still has the flexibility. Yes, or. And so here comes your critical concept about generalist and specialist, okay? This was kind of a clumsy introduction, but I want to try to make sure we're all on the same page because this is 3 stars. It comes up like a lot in this class. So get ready. In stable environments, specialists evolve because splitting niches lowers competition. In stable environments, specialists evolve because splitting niches lowers competition. Whereas in changing environments, generalists win out because they're more flexible.
What do you mean by that?
They're the ones that have the most babies. They're the species that persist. So have you guys heard that like alligators and sharks and pill bugs have been on our planet for like a gajillion years? If you think about it, those are really generalist species. Specialists are always the first ones to go extinct because they're really picky on a whole bunch of variables. You change a single variable and they're gone. Generalists are not very picky on most variables, so as those variables go up and down, generalists don't care. Did this make sense? The idea of niches splitting because competition's expensive, but generalists winning when environments are dynamic? Anybody want to ask me something about this? I know it's kind of abstract. How many of you have heard all this before, by the way, in other science classes? This is stuff that came up. Forgive me for being repetitive. A few of the students, I think, haven't heard this, so I have to Okay. Burmese python is cool. Introduced species is cool for number 3. Convergent evolution is super cool. I can show you some neat pictures really quick. Anybody know what that is?
Dolphin shark.
Dolphin. Did you say dolphin? Oh, it's the dolphin kind. Got it. And what is this?
Dolphin shark.
Dolphin, shark, swordfish? No, no, no.
Shark.
Nope. Porpoise is a type of dolphin. Nope. I don't think so. Oh, dolphin and what?
Swordfish, dolphin.
Did
It's like a
Nah. So you have on your left a dolphin, and on your right a very primitive dinosaur that lived in the ocean. These are not descended from each other. They are not genetically similar. They lived on the planet at very different times. This guy evolved recently from an animal that's sort of like a cow, hippopotamus, manatee. All the dolphins, all the whales, they evolved from a coastal mammal that's very similar to a hippo. That thing evolved from a reptile that lived 200 million years ago or so. That was sort of like a brontosaurus, a lazy marsh vegetarian dinosaur. And look at how similar they are. What you can't see is that they have a very different size. The dinosaur was about the size of this room, caddy corner to corner. Well, the dolphin is like small enough for me to see or even for the largest dolphins. Otherwise, everything else is the same. Their eyeballs face the same direction. It has the same shaped snout. The teeth are curved in the same way. They have roughly the same number of teeth. They both have a tail fin that goes like this. They both have a dorsal fin, pectoral, same body shape. They did the same type of hunting. They probably swam at about the same top speed, roughly. Mammals technically can swim a little faster. They did the same type of hunting. They would move very quickly and sneak up on slower prey and then just eat schools of smaller prey. I knew it until you started to mess with it, and then I forgot. Ichthyosaur, but it's like a petri ichthyosaur.
Scary looking dolphin.
dolphin and dinosaur.
Here's my question to you.
Dino.
Why do they look so similar? Yeah.
Because they evolved in similar biomes.
They did, and so what's that got to do with it? Yes, and
They got used to having to do similar types of hunting, got used to similar conditions and like that.
by got used to, I think you mean they adapted to?
Yeah.
They're in the
They
same.
adapted to similar types of hunting. Yeah?
They have the same niche. They're both. They're in the same place.
They both fill the same niche. That's roughly true. And so what's the one missing word here? Why would they still be similar? Why couldn't they do the same job and be very different?
Because it was the most
Natural.
like it was the best way to do that.
Here comes the deal. What's adaptive is defined by your niche. Like if you want to be a bird, an ocean thing that sneaks up on slow-moving prey, you kind of need that shape and you kind of need those teeth. And so you end up adapting the same tools because you're doing the same job. If two people had to invent tools for plumbing, they would probably come up with a similar toolbox. Because they're both trying to be plumbers, they're going to invent similar tools. Evolution does sort of the same thing. It favors the same adaptations. This is called convergent evolution, where species become more and more like each other. Anybody want to ask me anything else about 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, or 9?
Yeah, in the book it talked about divergent evolution, so is that pretty much just the opposite? Like
Divergence is when you split. So that's the opposite type. You're either coming to the same concepts or you're going into different concepts because you're going into different niches. What? Using images. Go ahead. I'm going to stop now, yes?
So, like the last vocab, like the reading packet vocab, is that for 7.2?
Reading packet for 7.3.2, yes, please. That's a living animal right now. That's why there's a picture of it. Oh, wait, hold on. What else? Oh, no, that's it. That's the dinosaur one.